Joining us now to discuss is retired Brigadier General for the U.S. Army National Guard, Greg Zanetti. Thank you, sir, for coming on today. That was just part of Zelensky's speech that we heard in his address to NATO. He's also mentioned that he wants additional military aid, including 500 Javelin, 500 Stinger missiles per day. Is that a fair ask?
I think so. I think what you're seeing right now is the Russians attacking the way they have attacked throughout their history. They lose in advance, and they don't really care about their losses. And I don't see Putin at all giving up on this. So yes, he's going to need weapons.
What did you make of the NATO summit yesterday? The fact that all these member nations were coming together, showing a united front, essentially. Did a moment stand out to you in what was finally presented?
What stunned me was the shift that we're going to do toward green energy to solve this war. I mean, this is the kind of thing that takes years, decades to implement. Meanwhile, we've got a war waging right now that clearly they need help and they need fossil fuels, and there was no answer to that. In fact, as you know, I'm from New Mexico. It's stunning to me that Biden has gone to the Middle East and to Venezuela to ask for oil, and yet he won't come to southeastern New Mexico or West Texas or Houston to get oil from our own country or open the Keystone Pipeline. But that aside, I don't know, Emma, sometimes it seems to me Biden's fighting a pretend war. He did nothing during the mobilization. He knew sanctions didn't work, but did them, and now comes up with this green energy solution for the energy issues of Europe. This doesn't seem very reasonable to me.
Well, let's talk about a possible greater threat, and that being the next steps Russia might take. Vladimir Putin might direct the use of chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons here. NATO, part of that meeting was essentially that they were activating a task force to prepare for if that might come. We didn't get, of course, specific details. But do you think that is what happens next, and will NATO be prepared to respond? How should they?
Well, I don't know if that would, I would be surprised if he would do that. What I'd actually be looking at is the other way. I would look at the Baltic states, because in his speech last week, Putin said, in essence, the Baltic states are his and always have been Russia's, and he's trying to paste back together the old Soviet Union. And the other thing I would say is this is it's becoming clear to me, this is step one in a much bigger plan. I'm watching what China is doing as far as stockpiling food and copper and aluminum and steel and pivoting towards a wartime economy. Then I'm watching what Iran is doing with their missiles headed toward Israel and their threats. And you start to think, wait, this isn't just about Ukraine. This is just the opening gambit. And the United States has to be prepared for something much bigger that seems to be coming.
You mentioned the sanctions. We heard about an additional round of sanctions from yesterday's meeting here. And we recall when President Biden's inner circle had said any action by Putin would be met with those strong and severe sanctions. Let's take a look in time here and recall what was said.
The purpose of the sanctions has always been and continues to be deterrence.
The purpose of the sanctions, in the first instance, is to try to deter Russia from going to war.
That sanctions are intended to deter.
They're meant to prevent and deter a large-scale invasion.
We want them to have a deterrent effect, clearly.
Okay, so the talking points went out, and everyone said that and reiterated it ahead of time, hoping that they would indeed deter Vladimir Putin. But here's the president, as you alluded to, and what he had to say yesterday to a reporter who asked him about it.
I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter. You keep talking about that. Sanctions never deter.
Going on to eventually say we're going to sustain what we're doing, not just the next month, the following month, maybe the remainder of the entire year. So essentially that you might see the effect later on. But of course, as you know, sir, the Ukrainian forces, they're fighting back, but how long can they continue to do so, even with these additional sanctions in place?
Well, they're very brave people with a long history, but at some point, Russia will wear them down if we don't help them more. And I think what we saw yesterday was confused and inept leadership. Meanwhile, sanctions have never worked. They didn't work against Angola. They didn't work against Cuba. They didn't work against Venezuela. They don't work against Iran. And meanwhile, Russia's already making the pivot to the east. They're selling their oil to China. India has said they would help Russia bypass the sanctions. You've got Iran actively helping the Russians with oil and energy, with the flow. And so, again, this seems like a pretend war to me, that Biden isn't really serious. And again, something much bigger is coming as a bloc is forming of China, Russia, Iran, and India to counterbalance the United States. And all we seem focused on is the 24-hour news cycle.
And reactive, quite frankly, what we're seeing from the White House. Greg Zanetti joining us on the program. Thank you, sir. We appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
You got it.